ministers, and other high-level representatives here with us today. Your presence underscores the importance of the subject matter that is under consideration. Before each of you is a list of speakers who requested to participate in today's open debate in accordance with Rules 37 and 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, as well as the previous practice of the Council in this regard. We propose that they be invited to participate in this meeting. There being no objection, it is so decided. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the following briefers to participate in this meeting. Mr. Chu Jong-yu, Director General of the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations. Mr. David Beasley, Executive Director of the United Nations World Food Program. And Ms. Sarah Menker, Founder and Chief Executive Officer of Grow Intelligence. It is so decided. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of item 2 of the agenda. I'd like to draw attention of council members to document S/2022/391. This is a letter dated 12 May 2022 from the Permanent Representative of the United States to the United Nations, addressed to the Secretary General, transmitting a concept note on the item under consideration. I now give the floor to the Secretary General, His Excellency.
To more than 3 million Ukrainians. Until March, their country was feeding the world with abundant supplies of food. I thank the United States government for focusing on this crucial issue during its presidency of the Council. Last year, most of the 140 million people suffering acute hunger around the world lived in just 10 countries: Afghanistan, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Ethiopia, Haiti, Nigeria, Pakistan, South Sudan, Sudan, Syria, and Yemen. 8 of these countries are on the agenda of this Council. Let there be no doubt, when this Council debates conflict, you debate hunger. When you make decisions about peacekeeping and political missions, you make decisions about hunger. And when you fail to reach consensus, hungry people pay a high price. Monsieur le Président, au niveau le plus élémentaire, les conflits armés créent la faim lorsque les combats détruisent les fermes et les usines, chassent les gens de leurs récoltes, provoquent des pénuries et font grimper les prix. Aujourd'hui, l'impact des conflits est amplifié par la crise climatique et l'insécurité économique qui est aggravée par la pandémie. Par conséquent, des décennies de progrès dans la lutte contre la faim sont en train d'être anéantis. Je l'ai constaté de mes propres yeux lors de ma visite au Sahel il y a 2 semaines. Prenez l'exemple du Niger, qui est confronté à des groupes armés extrémistes et à des incursions transfrontalières depuis le Mali et le Nigeria. Seulement 6% de sa population est entièrement vaccinée contre le Covid-19. Alors que le Niger est classé dernier selon l'indice de développement humain, il fait partie des 10 pays les plus vulnérables à la crise climatique. Le nombre de personnes en situation d'insécurité alimentaire aiguë au Niger a plus que doublé au cours des 2 dernières années. Et sans action immédiate, leur nombre pourrait atteindre 4 millions dès cette année. Le Niger et ses voisins ont besoin de toute urgence d'une mobilisation internationale coordonnée et de grande ampleur qui renforce les liens entre la paix, l'action humanitaire, l'adaptation aux impacts du dérèglement climatique et le développement durable. Excellencies, to help respond to this growing crisis, I'm pleased to announce today that we are releasing $30 million from the Central Emergency Response Fund, CERF, to meet urgent food security and nutrition needs in Niger, Mali, Chad, and Burkina Faso. But it is a drop in the ocean. Even it brings to almost $95 million the funding channeled through CERF to the Sahel since the start of the year. Mr. President, I'm also deeply concerned by the food security situation in the Horn of Africa, which is suffering the longest drought in 4 decades. More than 18 million people are affected, and the World Food Programme warns that millions of people in Somalia face famine within months. The perilous state of food security in Ethiopia and Somalia is compounded by continued conflict and deep insecurity. Mr. President, around the world, 49 million people in 43 countries are in emergency levels of hunger, known as IPC4, just one step away from famine. In other words, they are facing starvation and are doing everything they can to survive. As always, women and girls are worst affected, and this is reflecting in rising rates of trafficking, forced marriage, and other abuses. More than 500,000 people in Ethiopia, South Sudan, Yemen, and Madagascar are already at the so-called IPC level 5, which means catastrophic or famine conditions. The war in Ukraine is now adding a frightening new dimension to this picture of global hunger. Russia's invasion of its neighbor has effectively ended its food exports. Price increases of up to 30% for staple food threaten people in countries across Africa and the Middle East, including Cameroon, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and Yemen. I discussed this deeply troubling situation with the leaders of Senegal, Niger, and Nigeria during my last visit. They confirmed we are on the brink of a perfect storm that threatens to devastate people and economies. Our humanitarian operations are gearing up to help, backed by proven record of success. Humanitarian agencies and their partners helped to bring 6 countries in South Sudan back from the brink of famine last year. 6 counties, in South Sudan back from the brink of famine last year. They also prevented the worst outcomes over the past 6 years of conflict in Yemen, where food aid reached more than 10 million people a month in 2021. But humanitarians are also suffering the impact of rising food prices. In East Africa, the cost of food assistance has increased on average 65% in the past year. WFP has already been forced to reduce its support to 8 million hungry people in Yemen. Mr. President, I believe there are 4 actions countries can take now to break the deadly dynamic of conflict and hunger. First, investment in political solutions to end conflicts, prevent new ones, and build sustainable peace. Most important of all, we need to end the war in Ukraine. I call on all Council members to do everything in your power to silence the guns and promote peace in Ukraine and everywhere. Second, international humanitarian law, reflected in Resolution 2417 of this Council, specifies that goods and supplies that are essential to civilian survival, including food, crops, and livestock, must be protected. It also states that humanitarians must have unimpeded access to civilians in need. The Council has a critical role in demanding adherence to international humanitarian law and pursuing accountability when it is breached. I urge you to take maximum action to fulfill your role. Third, the interconnected risks of food insecurity, energy, and financing require far greater coordination and leadership. There is enough food for everyone in the world. The issue is distribution, and it is deeply linked to the war in Ukraine. I established the Global Crisis Response Group on Food, Energy, and Finance in March to provide data and analysis and propose solutions. The group immediately recommended that all food export restrictions should be lifted, strategic reserves should be released, and surpluses allocated to countries in need. As I told yesterday's call to action ministerial meeting, any meaningful solution to global food insecurity requires reintegrating Ukraine's agricultural production and the food and fertilizer production of Russia and Belarus into world markets despite the war. We are working to find a package deal that will enable Ukraine to export food, not only by train, but through the Black Sea, and that will bring Russian food and fertilizer production to world markets without restrictions. And this will require the goodwill of all countries concerned. Fourth, donors must fund humanitarian appeals in full. Almost halfway into 2022, our global humanitarian response plans are just 8% funded. In global terms, these are minuscule amounts. I urge countries to demonstrate the same generosity to all countries that has been shown in relation to the Ukraine. Official development assistance is more necessary than ever. Diverting it to other priorities is not an option while the world is on the brink of mass hunger. Indeed, the deep connections between conflict and hunger mean that generosity is not only an act of altruism. Feeding the hungry is an investment in global peace and security. Mr. President, in our world of plenty, I will never accept the death from hunger of a single child, woman, or man. Neither should the members of this Council. Thank you.
I thank the Secretary General for his briefing. I now give the floor to Mr. David Beasley.
Mr. Secretary, thank you very much. And Mr. Secretary General, thank you for your comments. You know, when the Nobel Peace Committee gave us the Nobel Peace Prize, it was clearly a message to the world that food security is critical to peace and stability all over the world. And what we're seeing now is an extraordinary destruction of the values that we hold so dear of feeding the poor and helping the needy around the world. Before the Ukraine crisis struck, I had been saying to leaders around the world that we were facing an unprecedented storm, a perfect storm because of conflict, climate, and COVID. And just when you thought it couldn't get any worse, Ethiopia. And then you thought it can't get any worse, and then Afghanistan. And then when you really thought it couldn't get any worse, Ukraine. And that's on top of areas that are struggling, as the Secretary General alluded to, with droughts, knocking on the door of famine, the Sahel, the Horn of Africa, and I could go as a ring of fire around the world. The numbers have escalated in terms of those marching to starvation from 80 million to 135 before COVID, and then because of COVID, 135 to 276 million people marching to starvation. And that number, because of the Ukrainian crisis, will rise to 323 million at least. Now, what's extremely troubling is out of those 276 million people that are marching towards starvation, struggling to find food on a daily basis, living from hand to mouth every day, there are 49 million people, as the Secretary General very clearly stated, in 43 countries that are knocking on famine's door. If you overlay those 49 million people in the 43 countries along with economic indices, because of the economic deterioration over time, the droughts, you begin to see which 43 countries very well could be destabilized, have famine, and resulting in not just death, but unrest and mass migration. We truly are at an unprecedented crisis. Food pricing is our number one problem right now as a result of all this perfect storm for 2022. But 2023, it very well will be a food availability problem. When a country like Ukraine that grows enough food for 400 million people is out of the market, it creates market volatility, which we are now seeing. In 2007 and 2008, we all witnessed what happened when pricing gets out of control. There were over 40 nations with political unrest, riots, and protests. We're already seeing riots and protesting taking place as we speak. Sri Lanka, Indonesia, Pakistan, Peru. We've seen destabilizing dynamics already in the Sahel, from Burkina Faso, Mali, Chad. These are only signs of things to come. And we have enough historical experience to understand the consequences when we fail to act. When a nation that is the breadbasket of the world becomes a nation with the longest bread lines of the world, we know we have a problem. And as the Secretary General clearly spoke, we're now reaching about 4 million people inside Ukraine. In fact, we're scaling up to 900,000 on cash-based transfers as we speak that will put liquidity back into the marketplace. But that does not solve the problem outside of Ukraine. That's why we've got to get these ports running. We've got to empty the silos so that we can help stabilize the food crisis that we're facing around the world. Over 36 nations get their 50% or more grain from this region. Those nations, overlaid with the 43 nations I was referring to, coupled with other economic indices and debt because of COVID, and you begin to see why the world is so very fragile. So we have to respond. Truly, failure to open those ports in Odessa region will be a declaration of war on global food security. And it will result in famine and destabilization and mass migration around the world. Many of you have been out in the field. You've talked to the poorest of the poor. I've had more mothers tell me, Mr. Beasley, my children hadn't been fed in 2 weeks. My husband had to join an extremist group just to stay alive. Or we have to migrate, or we have to choose between heating oil and cooking oil. And when a mother has to choose between freezing her child to death or starving her child to death, something's wrong, especially when there's so much wealth on the planet today, over $430 trillion worth of wealth today. The problem is going to get worse because the production around the world is going to decrease. And I think we all have been talking to the ministers of agriculture and leaders to maximize production as fast as we can. How do we get the fertilizers back out into the marketplace? Because the African Development Bank gave us some numbers the other day that were frightening. Africa alone will need over $2 billion of new fertilizer because of the cost, if they can get it at all, because of the smallholder farmers who rely on this. A loss of about $11 billion worth of food production in just Africa alone that's already struggling because of that perfect storm that we're talking about. The leaders in the world, it's time that we do every possible thing that we can to bring the markets to stability, because things will get worse. But I do have hope. We averted famine. We averted destabilization over the past many years because many of you in this room stepped up and we delivered. And we can do that again. But we've got things that have to happen: getting the ports open, stabilizing the markets, increasing production around the world. We'll get through this storm, but we must act, and we must act with urgency, and that must be today. Thank you, Mr. Secretary.
I thank Mr. Beasley for his briefing. I now give the floor to Mr. Chu Dongyu.
Mr. President, distinguished members of the Security Council, I feel deeply appreciate the opportunity to speak to the Council on this important topic and the continued attention placed on the issue of conflict and food security. 2 years ago, I briefed to the Council on the multiple risks facing global food security at the start of the pandemic. Today, we gather again for people, peace, prosperity, and the planet to discuss several overlapping crises on food safety, health safety caused by the climate change, food insecurity, COVID pandemic, and conflict. Worldwide, prosperity is being reversed. There is less food security, less health security, less income, and great inequality. My message today is more relevant than before. Agriculture is one of the keys to lasting peace and security. Excellencies, for the last 5 years, we have seen yet another spike in global level of acute hunger. According to the Global Report on Food Crisis, released 4th of May this year, in 2021, about 40 million more people experienced acute food insecurity compared to the 2020, bringing the total of 193 million people in 53 countries and territories. Worryingly, the projection is for further deterioration through the 2022, including places with catastrophic food insecurity. There is a farming risk in Yemen, Somalia, South Sudan, and Afghanistan. FAO has stepped up its effort to strengthen agri-food systems, save lives, and protect the agricultural livelihood of the world most vulnerable. From our cutting-edge analysis, normative work, our global national policy guidance, and our life-saving aid, FAO helps people, communities, and the government cope with the growing uncertainty. Yet, more needs to be done together. Conflict remains the single greatest driver of hunger. Between 2018 to 2021, the number of the people in crisis situations in countries where the conflict was the main driver of acute food insecurity increased by staggering 88% to just over 139 million people. As the world had begun to recover from the COVID-19, another conflict with a far-reaching effect broke out. The war in Ukraine revived the concerns of historic high food and energy prices and their impact across the world. The war has disrupted export, logistics, and seriously affected food availability in Ukraine and Russia Federation together export 30% of cereals, 67% of sunflower in the world. The increase in energy and fertilizer prices is putting the next global harvest at risk. According to our latest scenarios, it could be increased chronic undernourishment, another additional 18.8 million people by 2023. We are neighbors on this small planet village. What happens to one affects us all. FAO has and will continue to fully align with Secretary-General's call to end the war, restore peace, and save lives. We must strengthen the humanitarian development, peace, nexus. We must analyze the root cause of acute food insecurity, including conflict, climate change, and apply these learnings to our actions. FAO does this through our integrated phase classification, IPC, analysis. It's widely accepted. Our co-leadership of Global Network Against the Food Crisis and our co-leadership of Global Food Security Cluster. Excellencies, we must prevent acceleration of acute food insecurity trend in the coming months and years. Food production at the country level must be expanded. We need to provide cash and critical input for cereals and vegetable production, and to protect livestock with treatment, vaccinations, feed, and water. Agri-food supply chain and value chain must be strengthened with engagement of public and private sector in support of smallholder farmers and households. This is what FAO has been doing in Ukraine, Afghanistan, and others countries. In 2021, FAO reached more than 30 million people worldwide with emergency agricultural assistance and resilient building programs. For example, In Afghanistan, we reached 3 million people, including with wheat cultivation packages. This cost just $160 and met the stable cereals requirement for a family serving for an entire year. In local market, the cost for this same amount of food is 6 times higher. Our support helped the livestock farmers increase milk production equivalent to the level that would allow every Afghan child to have 1 glass of milk a day for at least 5 months. In Ethiopia, despite excess challenges, seeds and plant materials provided by FAO and agricultural cluster partners allowed local farmers to produce 900,000 tons of food, 5 times more than the humanitarian and commercial food supplies that entered the region. Despite this critical importance of agriculture to food availability and access in crisis contexts, only 8% of total funding for humanitarian food security sector goes to the agriculture. Excellencies, we must protect people, agricultural food systems, and economics against future shocks. To prevent the impact of conflict on food insecurity, we must increase the sustainable productivity, strengthen capacity to deliver relevant services and commodities, and provide access to innovative financial tools and digital services. Members urgently need to transform their agri-food systems to be more efficient, more inclusive, more resilient, and more sustainable for better production, better nutrition, a better environment, a better life, leaving no one behind. Last month, I traveled to Bangladesh, and Bangladesh with the innovation, they get the food supply with rice, and early this month, I traveled to see the young farmers in Azerbaijan. They produce 7 tons per hectare of winter wheat, use the new variety and irrigation systems and a proper fertilizer. It's a double yield. And yesterday, I got to know the Minister of Mexico. They can double the yield in some province of Mexico by using the new varieties, new fertilizer, and with irrigation, corn yield that can double. So it's a big potential. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I sincerely hope that you continue to provide the necessary aid for food insecurity globally, allocate new resources to sustain agricultural production in challenging contexts, and continue to recognize and support the role of agricultural food security, peace, and contribution of international organizations like FAO, IFAD, WFP, and others. Based on my professional knowledge and experience, we can feed the world sufficiently, sustainably, with existing tools if we all play our part. Like this country, Great America, irrigate land. You can produce 2 times more than unirrigated. It's a natural rain-fed farming. Only 80% of Arab land here are irrigated. In Asia, it's a 48 to 60. In Europe, it's 12%. And in Africa, only 3%. In Latin America, about 20%. So I strongly encourage all the members here and the partners here improve the water management, irrigation system, not only depend on God, depend on our technology and the investment on infrastructure. That's what we need to unleash the potential of innovation, science, and responsible investment. So many years, investment in rural areas agriculture, it's left behind so many years. No matter developed countries or developing countries, That's really, I strongly recommend to Mr. Blinken and others, look at those issues. And the soil and other big issues. We need at least 10 years, 20 years to look at the soil science. Soil and then quality seeds. You can improve the 20 to 30% of seed yield, like a hybrid rice, 30 to 50% increase, and a hybrid corn, it's a 30 to 40%. Minister of Mexico, he is an expert on breeder. Yeah? So technology is there, tool is there. We need a strong political commitment and also responsible investment. Work together with private sector and get all the key partners on board. That's why hand-in-hand initiative we needed to strengthen. Dear colleagues, you can put a policy in place that both increase productivity and protect natural resources. We always say produce more and better with less. How less? Less impact, less input, less impact, negative impact on environment. The solution is technology and good policy and management. You can invest more in innovation and new technology, especially in water management, irrigation systems, high quality agricultural input, include fertilizer, and in more transparent marketing information systems. Agricultural system provide food, feed, fiber, and biofuels, including biogas. So agriculture not only provide food, feed, fiber, cotton, fiber crops, and biofuels. That's real renewable energy. They support the future of the people on this small planet forever. On 19 May in 1943, our predecessors convened the first United Nations Conference on Food and Agriculture in Hot Spring, Virginia, United States of America. It's destiny, it's a coincidence. Today is, what is day? It's the 19th May. After 79 years, let's read back. Our founders saw that FAO must play the vital role in the quest for peace. They wrote, I quote, Food and Agriculture Organization is born out of the need for peace as well as the need for freedom from want. The two are interdependent. Progress towards freedom from want is essential to lasting peace. Much has changed since then, after 79 years. But one thing remains constant. The world needs enough food, good food, and better food for all. Investing in our agri-food systems is more relevant than ever. Let us work together effectively and coherently. I learned from the Secretary General, he transferred from English to French. Now I transfer to last words in Chinese. We are 6 UN languages. So I made a special poem to the president. 山高人未峰，民以食为天。团结一条心，两岸会万民。Best wishes to President Mr. Blinken, FLDG, on 19th of May, 2022. I thank you.
I thank Mr. Chu for his briefing. I'd now like to give the floor to Ms. Sarah Manker.
Thank you, Mr. President, for inviting me to address the Security Council. Your Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, it is an honor to be here today to highlight and reaffirm that food security is, in fact, national security and global stability. Before I share some data-driven insights on the state of our global food systems, Let me tell you a little bit about Grow Intelligence. Grow is a company founded to help tackle two of the greatest challenges we face as humanity: food security and climate change. We are a global company with offices in Nairobi, Singapore, and New York. Our team comes from over 40 countries that range from Ethiopia, where I am from, to Russia, Nigeria, India, the United States, China, and Ukraine. We are a company of domain experts in software infrastructure, climate science, agronomy, trading, and financial markets. We combine that with world-class engineering and AI talent. We work with large and small companies. We work with financial institutions, and we work with multiple governments. I come here today to share insights from our data with the underlying hope that all of us here with the power to change the course of history will choose to do so. I want to start by explicitly saying that the Russia-Ukraine war did not start a food security crisis. It simply added fuel to a fire that was long burning. A crisis we detected tremors from long before the COVID-19 pandemic exposed the fragility of our supply chains. I share this because we believe it's important for you all to understand that even if the war were to end tomorrow, our food security problem isn't going away anytime soon without concerted action. Now, on to the statistics. Grow Intelligence estimates show that price increases in major food crops year to date has made an additional 400 million people food insecure. Now, there are a few food insecurity statistics shared, so I want to define that by saying this, looking at number of people at $3.59 a day. So broader, but the march towards starvation. To put this into perspective, that is equivalent to the number of people that China has taken out of poverty in the last 20 years. In 5 months, we have undone 20 years of progress. Furthermore, our economic shock models show that year-to-date changes in prices of agricultural products have already affected some economies by 3 to 5% of their GDPs. Countries disproportionately affected are in regions such as North Africa and the Middle East, the Horn of Africa, and West and Central Asia. And it can get much worse. Data shows the food security challenges we face will last several years. There are 5 major challenges occurring simultaneously that are each individually extraordinary: lack of fertilizer, climate disruptions, record low inventories in cooking oils, record low inventories in grains, and logistical bottlenecks that have already started to unravel decades of global economic progress. Without substantial, immediate, and aggressive coordinated global actions, we stand the risk of an extraordinary amount of both human suffering and economic damage. This isn't cyclical. This is seismic. It's a once-in-a-generation occurrence that can dramatically reshape the geopolitical era. Now on to the 5 challenges. Fertilizers first. Global fertilizer prices have nearly tripled year on year and quadrupled over the past 2 years because of supply shocks driven by logistical bottlenecks, restrictions on natural gas which impact the ability to produce fertilizer, sanctions, and export restrictions amidst the Russia-Ukraine war. This risks significant crop yield reductions in key producing regions such as Brazil, the United States, and Western Europe later this year and next year, severely impacting global food security and inflation for the next 3 to 5 years at a minimum. 2, climate. Global drought conditions for wheat are the worst in over 20 years around the world. Major bread baskets, such as the United States and Brazil, the world's 2 largest exporters of agricultural products, are also experiencing extreme droughts. For example, Brazil's cropland soil moisture is at a 20-year low. Major grain importers in the Middle East and Africa are also experiencing record droughts. Namely, we have both major importers and exporters experiencing exceptional drought conditions. 3, cooking oils. The price of traditionally cheap palm oil has nearly tripled in the last 2 years, driven by increased biofuels demand, drought in regions that produce alternative cooking oils such as Brazil and Canada, record import demand from China, and the loss of nearly 75% of global sunflower oil exports due to the Russia-Ukraine war. The recent export ban in Indonesia, the world's largest palm oil producer who is responsible for 60% of global production, has added significant upward price pressure to vegetable oils. 4, grains. Official government agency estimates from around the world put wheat inventories at 33% of annual consumption. Verifiable data from public and private sources that we as a company organize and then build statistical models to connect the dots between in our platform show that global wheat inventories are in fact closer to 20%, a level not seen since the financial and commodity crisis of 2007 and 8. We currently only have 10 weeks of global consumption sitting in inventory around the world. Conditions today are worse than those experienced in 2007 and 8. It is important to note that the lowest grain inventory levels the world has ever seen are now occurring while access to fertilizers is highly constrained and drought in wheat-growing regions around the world is the most extreme it's been in over 20 years. Similar inventory concerns also apply to corn and other grains. Government estimates are not adding up. 5, logistics. Russia and Ukraine used to provide nearly a third of the world's wheat exports and are in the top 5 exporters of corn globally. Combined, they used to export 75% of global sunflower oil supplies. All Ukrainian ports remain closed, making it impossible to move any of Ukraine's harvested grain across its borders. Shifting to rail will move less than 10% of pre-war flow. It's not enough. Russian exports, which also include fertilizer, are limited because of Black Sea maritime hazards. Any one of the 5 things I outlined would be considered a major issue in commodity markets. The 5 combined are truly unprecedented. I come here today not to specifically offer or provide solutions, as there will be other venues to do so, but rather to X-ray and diagnose the problem for those of you in this room that have the power to change the course of our history. In a world that is increasingly isolationist, we need to come together. Food is personal, but our agricultural systems are global. There is no version of the world where every country has all the natural resources it needs to survive and thrive. One key takeaway from our data is how often we see repeated examples of cause and effect, highlighting surprising connections and interdependencies. For example, the United States, the most self-sufficient country globally, a consumption-weighted basket of food, a grocery basket, has doubled in price since April of 2020. Price increases were driven by unprecedented demand around the world, increase alongside climate-related supply-side shocks. We cannot solve food insecurity on a national scale anywhere. One thing we strongly believe: we can have a healthy economy and secure food system without degrading our environment. We have the capability to help everyone feel secure about having enough food. Data helps us navigate because we aren't blind to food security-related risks and outcomes. We can't say we didn't know. There are positive solutions and approaches that can be offered and delivered, but they will require coordinated global effort. We are all dependent on one another. In wrapping up, what does the data tell us about risk and interdependencies? It tells us, not unlike the global financial crisis of 2008, there are fault lines and tremor-like early warning signals that are seemingly disconnected globally, but they aren't. What does the data tell us about hope? It tells us that while the next few years are going to likely be difficult as a result of the statistically unusual confluence of the 5 challenges I shared, we can coordinate a global response, eschew to each their own mentality as to food security and climate risk, be willing to have constructive, albeit discussion, at difficult conversations, and jointly accept that what we have to address is less of a food shortage and more of a crisis of prioritization. I thank you.
I thank Ms. Maker for her briefing. I shall now make a statement in my capacity as the Secretary of State of the United States of America. And again, good morning to everyone. Thank you all very much for being here. My thanks to the Secretary General, to Executive Director Beasley, to Director General Chu, and to Grow Intelligence CEO Sarah Manker. Thank you for the superb briefings of the Council today that bring powerfully before us the facts and the challenge that we have to meet. And thank you for your work every day on an issue that is truly critical to humanity. We do meet at a moment of unprecedented global hunger, fueled, as we've heard, by climate change, by COVID-19, and made even worse by conflict. Indeed, conflicts around the world are increasingly driving this crisis. According to the Food and Agriculture Organization and the World Food Program, the number of people affected by food insecurity due to conflict rose from about 100 million people in 2020 to 139 million or so people in 2021, to an estimated 161 million people in 2022. The World Bank believes that Russia's war in Ukraine could add another 40 million people to this total. Yesterday, we had ministers from more than 30 countries come together here at the United Nations to address the drivers of and advance solutions to global food insecurity, including by meeting the urgent need for food, for fertilizer, humanitarian financing, investing more in the resilience of agriculture and vulnerable populations. For our part, the United States announced another $215 million in emergency food assistance to add to our $2.3 billion in humanitarian food aid since February. I want to thank all of the countries that stepped up, and I want to encourage others to join us. In 2018, this Council adopted Resolution 2417, which condemned the use of starvation of civilians as a tool of war, and noted that such a use may constitute a war crime. Yet, in the years since that resolution, the problem has only grown worse. The Russian Federation's flagrant disregard of this resolution is just the latest example of a government using the hunger of civilians to try to advance its objectives. It's also another example of how Russia is violating the rules-based international order that is integral to the shared security and prosperity of all UN member states, an order this Council, and in particular, its permanent members, have a responsibility to uphold, to defend, and to strengthen. In this Council, a few members have repeatedly used language lamenting the suffering caused by this war and calling on all sides to bring it to a stop. Let's not use diplomatic speak to obfuscate what are simple facts. The decision to wage this war is the Kremlin's, and the Kremlin's alone. If Russia stopped fighting tomorrow, the war would end. If Ukraine stopped fighting, there would be no more Ukraine. Russia's unprovoked war of aggression has halted maritime trade in large swaths of the Black Sea. It's made the region unsafe for navigation, trapping Ukrainian agricultural exports, as we've heard, jeopardizing global food supplies. Since February 24th, Russian naval operations have demonstrated the intent to control access to the northwestern Black Sea, the Sea of Azov, to block Iranian ports. Our assessment is that this is a deliberate effort, evidenced through a series of actions taken by the Russian government. On the first day of the invasion, Russia issued an official warning to all members that significant areas of the Black Sea were closed to commercial traffic, essentially shutting them down to shipping. Since then, the Russian military has repeatedly blocked safe passage to and from Ukraine by closing the Kerch Strait, tightening its control over the Sea of Azov, stationing warships off Ukrainian ports, and Russia has struck Ukrainian ports multiple times. These and other actions have effectively cut off all commercial naval traffic in and around the port of Odessa. The Russian Federation has mirrored these attacks on land, repeatedly attacking Ukrainian civilian infrastructure that is critical to the production and transport of food, such as water, power, rail lines, destroying Ukrainian grain storage facilities, stealing stocks of food in the parts of Ukraine that it illegally occupies. The consequences of these actions have been devastating. The food supply for millions of Ukrainians and millions more around the world has quite literally been held hostage by the Russian military. The World Food Program recently estimated that a third of all Ukrainians are facing food insecurity, with children, pregnant women, the elderly at heightened risk of malnutrition. In besieged cities like Mariupol, Russian forces have repeatedly blocked the delivery of food and other life-saving aid to tens of thousands of trapped civilians. A mother who recently escaped from the city talked about the agony of watching her 6-year-old daughter suffer the daily pang of hunger and being powerless to do anything about it. "I just sobbed," she said, screaming into a pillow when no one could see. She and her children eventually escaped. Countless thousands of others are still trapped. The Russian government seems to believe that using food as a weapon will help accomplish what its invasion has not: to break the spirit of the Ukrainian people. Still, Ukrainians are going to great lengths to feed their own people and to feed the world. Farmers in Ukraine continue to risk their lives to produce wheat and other crops. Many have returned to fields that are filled with mines. They wear bulletproof vests and helmets as they harvest. And, as we've heard already powerfully this morning, it's not only Ukrainians who are suffering. As a result of the Russian government's actions, some 20 million tons of grain sit unused in Ukrainian silos as global food supplies dwindle, prices skyrocket, causing more around the world to experience food insecurity. This includes countries already under enormous duress. The Secretary General alluded to a number of them, like Lebanon, which usually gets 80% of its wheat imports from Ukraine. Somalia, already on the brink of a famine, even before Russian tanks rolled into Ukraine, and which must now deal with rising wheat and flour costs. The Russian Federation claims falsely that the international community's sanctions are to blame for worsening the global food crisis. Sanctions aren't blocking Black Sea ports, trapping ships filled with food, and destroying Ukrainian roads and railways. Russia is. Sanctions are not emptying Ukrainian grain silos and stealing Ukrainian farm equipment. Russia is. Sanctions aren't preventing Russia from exporting food and fertilizer. The sanctions imposed by the United States and many other countries deliberately include carve-outs for food, for fertilizer, and seeds from Russia. And we're working with countries every day to ensure that they understand that sanctions do not prevent the flow of these items. Nope. The decision to weaponize food is Moscow's, and Moscow's alone. Don't take my word for it. Even Dmitry Medvedev, the deputy chairman of Russia's Security Council, former Russian president, recently said that Russia's agricultural products were, and I quote, "its quiet weapon," end quote. He then added, and I quote, "quiet but ominous," end quote. This council has a unique responsibility to address the current crisis, which constitutes a serious threat to international peace and security. That starts by strongly and unequivocally calling the Kremlin out for its atrocities in Ukraine and for worsening the global food crisis through an unprovoked war of aggression. More concretely, members of the Council, and for that matter, every UN member state, should press Russia to stop actions that are making the food crisis in Ukraine and around the globe worse than it already was. Stop blockading the ports in the Black Sea and the Sea of Azov. Allow for the free flow of ships and trains and trucks carrying food out of Ukraine. Stop preventing food and other life-saving supplies from reaching civilians in besieged Ukrainian towns and cities. Stop threatening to withhold food and fertilizer exports from countries that criticize your war of aggression. All of this is essential to save lives in Ukraine and to save lives around the world. The Russian Federation is not the only government or organization to exploit food insecurity for its own cynical ends. South Sudan, armed groups and warring parties have for years blocked humanitarian assistance to civilians. Experts estimate that up to 7 million people will face crisis levels of food insecurity in the country in this year. In Syria, with the Kremlin's ongoing support, the Assad regime has besieged communities like Eastern Ghouta and caused the widespread starvation of its own people. It also routinely obstructs the cross-border delivery of life-saving humanitarian aid, robbing and even attacking United Nations convoys, as we've discussed repeatedly in this Council. This Council must consistently call out governments and armed groups when they use similar tactics, like attacking the means of food production and distribution, blocking humanitarian aid from reaching those in need, besieging civilian populations. The United Nations was created with the aim of advancing human rights and preventing atrocities, including the atrocity of using starvation as a weapon against civilians, like during the siege of Leningrad by the Nazis, during which an estimated 1 million Russians lost their lives, including many who starved to death. Among the victims was the 1-year-old brother of President Putin. Or during the Holodomor, during which millions of Ukrainians died of hunger due to a Soviet campaign of forced collectivization and terror. It is on us to prevent this history from repeating itself, to make sure that the past is not prologue. It's simple. The lives of millions of people depend upon it. I now resume my function as President of the Council, and I would like to give the floor to Her Excellency Shirley Ayokor Bachwe, the Minister of Foreign Affairs and Regional Integration of Ghana.
Thank you, Mr. President. Secretary of State Anthony Blinken, I would like to thank you and the U.S. delegation for highlighting the very important subject of armed conflict and food insecurity during your presidency of the Council. I'd also like to thank Secretary General Antonio Guterres, also the WFP Executive Director, the FAO Director General, and the founder and CEO of Grow Intelligence for their briefing. We appreciate their useful perspectives on armed conflict and food insecurity. Mr. President, this Council is no stranger to the harrowing reports of starvation and other forms of food insecurity caused by conflict in different parts of the world. Millions of people, especially children, have suffered or perished from food insecurity in the challenging periods of conflict that my own continent has had to endure, especially over the past 3 decades. The food systems of those countries in conflict usually collapse, with huge consequences for the economy, livelihoods, and living standards. Those impacts were localized, and those of us who lived outside the theater of war were involved only in as much as our conscience compelled us to act, including taking in refugees or by intervention through peace support operations. Today, however, perhaps the first time since the Second World War, we see the impact of one conflict on food security in every country, every home, and on everyone. We experience together the profound anxiety of a global economy in uncharted waters, buffeted by uncertain headwinds. It is in this context that Ghana welcomes the important contribution that Resolution 2417 makes in acknowledging the interlinkages between conflict and hunger. There is still much to be done to build resilience in food systems and enhance global respect for norms relating to the population's right to food, regardless of the state of conflict, and to integrate peace-building objectives into the creation of resilient food systems with a backward interlock of food security objectives into peace-building programs and activities. Mr. President, as we mark the 4th anniversary of the Council's adoption of Resolution 2417 this month, unfolding global events continue to be a rude and painful reminder of the debilitating linkages between armed conflict, hunger, and food security. Though the current global food insecurity crisis predates Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the war has clearly exposed the interconnected nature and fragility of global food systems, with serious consequences for global food and nutrition security, particularly for vulnerable countries and populations. The food crisis that millions of the world's citizens confront now, especially in Africa, which is the hardest hit, cannot wait until we have a perfect outcome among all states. What is needed are purposeful actions that support efforts of developing countries such as the African Common Position for Sustainable Food Systems. Those actions must focus on building resilience in economies and food systems. The scale and effectiveness of the efforts of the IMF and the World Bank in filling the financing gap in Africa in response to the COVID-19 pandemic through fast-track facilities, contingency emergency financing, as well as the IMF's issue of special drawing rights, amongst others, provide a model for addressing short-term shortages and building resilience. It also requires action by the parties to the conflict to facilitate the movement of food and fertilizers through the Black Sea ports and other transportation lanes, and we call on those in a position to do so to act in the interest of international cooperation and the values of our United Nations. We are encouraged by the role that global humanitarian hubs such as the International Humanitarian City in Dubai and regional humanitarian hubs like the one in Accra can play in interconnecting humanitarian needs with food availability. The international humanitarian community must deepen their national and regional coordination mechanisms for programming and responding to humanitarian crises and align their interventions with national and regional response plans. Additionally, major donors must cooperate to shift funds out of separate silos to enable integrative work, and also in a manner that does not prioritize food distribution to vulnerable communities over the sustainable approach of helping them to reconstruct their food systems. In concluding, I'd like to stress Ghana's readiness to join any efforts aimed at removing export restrictions on excess grains, to bring on stream grains in parts of Eastern Europe where the present conflict is raging, a reactivation of global maritime transport with a priority on food supply, and to ensure that those countries that are experiencing the perfect storm of pandemic and war have the required credit to purchase grains and food supply. We must do all in our power to prevent starvation and death anywhere, and to restore economic and financial stability for the sake of all our peoples. I thank you for your attention.
I thank Her Excellency, Ms. Botchway, for her statement. I'd like to give the floor now to Her Excellency, Ms. Rachel Omomo, Cabinet Secretary for Foreign Affairs of Kenya.
Thank you, Mr. President, for giving me the floor. I congratulate you, Honorable Secretary of State, for the United States' able stewardship of the Security Council this month. And I thank you for this invitation to this important open debate. and also express the gratitude of our delegation to you for leading insightful conversations on the important subject of food security over the last 2 days. It takes courage to lead, and we thank you. I also thank the Secretary General and the other distinguished briefers for their insightful remarks. I particularly applaud Sarah, who I know from Kenya. I say asante shukran. Mr. President, throughout history, sharp and rapid rises in food prices have often been a root cause of social unrest, political stability, and violent conflict. Even today, the price of bread in many countries is a reliable indicator of rising political tensions. The fact that we are having this discussion in the Security Council is proof that the recent rise in food insecurity may lead to heightened threats to international peace and security. The facts, to say the least, are alarming. In the Horn of Africa, an extreme drought could cause up to 20 million people to go hungry this year, and many of those people will be women and children. This emergency is making it more difficult to pursue and sustain peace. It is making entire populations dependent on food aid and is becoming part of the conflict dynamics in our region as militants and belligerents exploit the emergency to entrench their control and access to financing. There is a strong connection between the food shortages in Yemen, in Afghanistan, in the Sahel, and in parts of the Horn of Africa, and conflict-related instabilities. In Somalia, Al-Shabaab, an Al-Qaeda-affiliated terrorist group, last year alone displaced nearly 30,000 people from 42 villages. It imposed blockades in various towns in the Bokol region, leading to shortages of food and essential commodities since early 2021. This weaponization of food is a matter that should be of concern to all of us at the United Nations Security Council. Mr. President, more recently, the war in Ukraine is causing unprecedented global food and energy supplies disruptions. With Ukraine and Russia as major global suppliers of wheat, sunflower oil, barley, as well as fertilizer, the conflict-induced disruptions have driven food prices sharply higher. We commiserate with the people of Ukraine, and we understand their suffering, which is real and regrettable. But we also wish to note that this war is leading to many more victims around the world. Against this background, Kenya appreciates the Secretary General's initiative in establishing the Global Crisis Response Group on Food, Energy, and Finance. Its recommendations offer us a useful starting point in the immediate actions we need to take in response to the immediate pressures we are facing, particularly in Africa and in the developing countries. However, colleagues, we must do more than take short-term actions in the hope of a return to the status quo. That status quo, even before the outbreak of the war in Ukraine, was filled with expanding and protracted famines. The status quo must be unacceptable to all of us. We must address it with alacrity through cooperation and through a new kind of multilateralism, a multilateralism that uplifts and focuses on the weakest of our peoples. We need to learn from COVID-19 and the pandemic that it has spawned throughout the world, that we need to be taught and we need to learn that manufacturing capability and production must spread into different regions of the world. In the same way that the pandemic invites us to seek fundamental change, this food crisis calls for us to reach for bolder solutions. One of the least appreciated and most consequential changes underway should inform this conversation, and that is the impact of population growth in Africa and in the developed world. There is increasing certainty in the projection that Africa's population may reach 2.5 billion by 2015. And this population will move from the rural areas to urban settings, leaving Africa with fewer farmers, fewer hands to produce food. The ability to provide this enormous population with affordable food, decent jobs, security, and other public goods means that Africa must have competent states, states able to deliver value for their people. And therefore, as we tackle food security, let us tackle the capacity challenges in Africa. Let us build strong states with strong capabilities. Recognizing this, His Excellency President Uhuru Kenyatta made food security one of his big 4 agenda items in his second term. This has led to higher investment in the agricultural sector, subsidies for fertilizers for small-scale farmers, and a focus on increasing the income of farmers through improved market linkages based on ICT platforms. There's a lot more that we need to do in Kenya. And there's a lot more that we need to do worldwide and in Africa to ensure that food security does not become an existential threat for all of us. Lack of ambition, lack of innovation, lack of courage will be the only impediment to finding solutions for the multiple crises that are beginning to grow throughout the world. It is for this reason that we look forward to welcoming all of you to the second UN Oceans Conference that Kenya will co-host with Portugal in June this year. This conference will give us an opportunity to harness and integrate the dividends of the oceans into a sustainable and equitable food future. We must use all the food available to mankind. We must use our oceans. We must use our land to increase productivity for our people. Allow me, therefore, as I close, to make some proposals on how we can act together, as I said, in a spirit of change, in a spirit of multilateralism, and in a spirit of cooperation, so that we can be that generation that answered the historical call to action at a time such as this. First, let us shift Africa's place in the global trading system. We can no longer solely be the source of raw materials and cash crops while importing food to feed the fastest growing population in the world. We need to modernize our agricultural systems, not only for large-scale farmers, but for small, poor, rural farmers. Africa must move beyond rain-fed agriculture, and we need to build fertilizer factories, seed factories, pesticide factories. We need research institutions. We need to be able to provide our farmers with the know-how, the data, and the will to invest in agriculture. A big part of that is ensuring that in addition to feeding domestic demand, agricultural markets in Europe and other wealthier regions must also open their doors to African products, African food products. The end of unnecessary tariffs must go. The countries with the largest shareholdings in international financial institutions need to insist on a fundamental shift in financing, enabling agricultural and food systems transformation, and this must include climate change financing with an emphasis on adaptation to assist those who suffer from climate shocks perpetually. Second, it is essential to build a bridge between humanitarian assistance, development, and peace building. Long-term food assistance should actively integrate peace-building approaches by prioritizing the humanitarian development and peace nexus. If we are to improve food security needs, greater cooperation and coordination between actors in humanitarian assistance and development cooperation and peace building is fundamental. Adding to this, the Security Council must demand that all parties to armed conflict comply with their obligations under international humanitarian law by taking constant care to spare civilian objects, including objects necessary for food production, and also unlocking embargoes and blockades that prevent the movement of food. Third, local response mechanisms and capacities to food crises and conflicts need to be better understood and integrated into relief operations as well as national response strategies. Fourth, the international community must unite in upholding the values of market openness with the understanding that food security is a transnational problem. Fifth, and even more crucially, to establish and build on existing global emergency mechanisms that include debt restructuring, debt delay, and food aid, given that traditional approaches must not only respond adequately to extreme global food shocks, but they must also upbuild and strengthen nations. Mr. President, breaking the link between conflict and hunger and harnessing the potential of food security to contribute to peace demands our collective action and objective collaboration. We must therefore strive to uphold Resolution 2417 because our aspirations for development, security, and human progress rest on achieving food security for all. I thank you.
I thank Her Excellency Ms. Omamo for her statement. I would like to now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Michael Moussa Adamo, Minister for Foreign Affairs of Gabon.
Monsieur le Président, je vous félicite